They smiled at my daughter's funeral like they were at a cocktail party. I'm not talking about distant relatives who didn't know her well. I'm talking about the people who sat across from me at Thanksgiving every single year for 11 years. The people who had eaten my food, drunk my wine, slept in my guest rooms, and borrowed money they never returned. I'm talking about my husband's family, the Caldwells of Newport Beach, and on the worst day of my life, they were networking. My name is Lorian Vance, and before that day, I believed I was one of them. I had married into California money the way some women marry into religions, with full devotion, willing sacrifice, and absolutely no understanding of what I was actually signing up for. Preston Caldwell was charming, in the way that only men raised on inherited wealth can be charming, effortlessly, dangerously, like sunlight on the surface of very deep water. When we married 12 years ago, his mother Sylvia had hugged me at the reception and whispered, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart." And I had cried because I'd grown up with nothing, and suddenly I had everything. What no one tells you about everything is that it comes with conditions. My daughter Wren was 7 years old when she was diagnosed. By 9, she was gone. Those 2 years sit inside my chest like stones I will carry for the rest of my life, and I won't describe them here because some grief is not meant to be narrated. It is only meant to be survived. What I will tell you is that Wren left behind a trust fund of $310,000 established by my own mother, who had scraped and saved for decades specifically so that my children would never know the financial anxiety that had defined our entire family's history. It was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for me. It was Wren's, and then, because Wren was gone, it was supposed to come to me. I want you to hold that number, $310,000. Because in the 48 hours following my daughter's private memorial service, while I was sedated in our Newport Beach home, while my husband was managing logistics, while I was not capable of reading a single document, $73,000 of that inheritance disappeared in one single day. One day. And I didn't find out for 6 weeks. Here's what the Caldwells looked like from the outside, and I need you to understand this before I tell you what they looked like from the inside, because the gap between those two images is where everything terrible lived. Preston's father, Gerald Caldwell, had made his money in commercial real estate in the 90s and spent the next 3 decades polishing that money into something that looked like class. They owned a 7-bedroom in Newport Beach, a ski chalet in Park City, and a boat named Meridian that cost more annually in maintenance than my childhood home was worth. Sylvia Caldwell wore Chanel to grocery stores without irony. Preston's sister, Bridget, had a lifestyle brand on Instagram with 400,000 followers, built entirely on the aesthetic of a life she couldn't actually afford without her parents' constant funding. Preston's younger brother, Colt, was 34 and had never held a job for longer than 8 months, but he drove a Porsche Cayenne and always had front-row tickets to everything. They were the kind of family that made other people feel small just by existing in their orbit. And I had spent 11 years trying to be worthy of them. But here's what no one saw coming, not even me. 6 weeks after Wren's memorial, I was sitting in the office of my estate attorney, a woman named Harriet Bloom, who had been handling my mother's finances for 20 years and who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and did not believe in softening information. She slid a bank statement across her desk and looked at me over the rims of those glasses and said, "Lorian, I need you to look at this very carefully." The trust had been partially liquidated. $73,000 had been moved in a single transaction on October 14th, 3 days after Wren's memorial service, to an account I didn't recognize. The authorization signature was Preston's, and Preston was listed as co-trustee, a designation my mother had added because we were married and she had trusted him, because I had told her to trust him, because I had believed, God help me, I had actually believed that he was a safe person to trust. "Who does this account belong to?" I asked, and my voice was very calm, which surprised me because nothing inside me was calm at all. Harriet took off her glasses. "That's what we need to find out." I drove home that afternoon and I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes without going inside. The house was gorgeous. 4,000 square feet of California modern with ocean views and a chef's kitchen and a primary suite that had been featured in a design magazine the previous spring. I had chosen every single thing in that house, every tile, every light fixture, every throw pillow. I had built that life with my own two hands, and I had thought it was mine. I thought about calling Preston. I didn't. Instead, I called my best friend, Cass Rivera, who was a forensic accountant in San Diego and who had told me 17 different times over 11 years that something about the Caldwells felt off to her. I had dismissed her every single time. I had defended them. I had made excuses. I had told her she just didn't understand how wealthy families operated. "Cass," I said when she picked up, "I need you to help me find something." There was a pause. "How bad is it?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I think it's bad." "Okay," she said, and I could hear her already pulling up her laptop. "Okay, Laura, I got you." What Cass found over the next 2 weeks should be its own horror story. The $73,000 hadn't gone to one account. It had been split, laundered through a series of transfers that would have looked like normal financial activity to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for patterns. Cass was specifically looking for patterns. $14,000 went to a luxury hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona, the kind of place with a spa menu that cost more than most people's rent. $9,000 went to something listed as a consulting fee to a company called Bridget Caldwell Creative LLC, which, for those keeping track, was Preston's sister's lifestyle brand, registered as a business. Another portion went to cover what appeared to be Colt's outstanding debt on the Porsche, and the remaining balance, the largest chunk, went to a personal account that was registered in Nevada under a name I didn't recognize. A name I had never heard Preston mention once in 11 years of marriage. Tatum Reed. I said the name out loud in Cass's kitchen, and it tasted like metal. "Do you know who that is?" Cass asked carefully. "No," I said. Then I said, "Not yet." Now, here is the part where most women in movies would cry. I did not cry. I had spent 2 years watching my daughter fight for her life, and I had cried every day of those 2 years, and I had nothing left. What I had instead was something colder and cleaner, and far more dangerous. I had absolute clarity. I went back to Newport Beach that night. I made dinner, I poured Preston a glass of the Napa Cab he liked, I asked him about his day, I watched him talk and laugh and refill his own glass, and I studied him the way you study something you're about to dismantle, carefully, completely, without any emotional interference. He didn't know I knew. That was my only advantage, and I intended to use it like a surgeon's scalpel. The Caldwell family's annual October trip to Park City had been planned for months, and Preston assumed we were still going. I almost canceled. Then I thought about it differently. The whole family in one place for 4 days, a luxury ski resort hotel, all of them relaxed and confident and completely unaware that I had spent the last 2 weeks building a paper trail that could destroy all of them. I packed my bags. I smiled at Preston. I said, "I can't wait." Bridget was already at the hotel. Sylvia and Gerald had flown in the day before. The whole family, assembled in their natural habitat of $500 a night hotel suites and room service and the absolute conviction that the world existed to accommodate them. The resort was stunning, I'll give them that. Park City in October is all golden aspens and cold mountain air and the kind of beauty that makes you feel like your problems are too small to be real. The hotel lobby smelled like cedar and money. The staff knew the Caldwells by name. I checked in smiling. I smiled through dinner that first night. I smiled through Sylvia's passive-aggressive comments about my hair and Bridget's pointed questions about whether I was thinking about going back to work now, as if grief had an expiration date, as if I was supposed to just snap back into productivity mode 6 weeks after burying my child. And then, during dessert, I excused myself to use the restroom, and instead I walked to the hotel business center and I sent 3 emails. One to Harriet Bloom, one to Kaz Rivera, and one to a private investigator named Dex Farrow, who had been working quietly on my behalf for 10 days, and had, that afternoon, sent me a photograph that explained exactly who Tatum Reed was. You want to know what was in that photograph? I know. Sit tight. Back at the table, Bridget was refilling her champagne and laughing too loudly at something Colt had said. And I watched her and thought about that $9,000 consulting fee paid from my dead daughter's inheritance to her Instagram brand, and I kept my face completely neutral. Sylvia was watching me across the table with those pale, calculating eyes she'd always had, the eyes that had never fully accepted me. Not really. Not in 11 years. And she leaned toward Bridget and said something just low enough that she thought I couldn't hear. I heard it. "No one really likes her," Sylvia said. "They just tolerate her because of Preston." And Bridget laughed, and Sylvia laughed, and I took a sip of my water and looked out at the mountain and thought, okay then. Later that night, in the hotel suite, I opened my laptop while Preston slept. Dex's report was thorough. It always was. That's why I'd hired him. Tatum Reed was 29 years old. She lived in a condo in Henderson, Nevada. She had been in a relationship with Preston for approximately 3 years. She had received several transfers from various accounts over that time period, but the transfer from Wren's trust was the largest by a significant amount, made, according to Dex's source at the hotel, 2 days before Tatum checked into a Scottsdale resort with someone matching Preston's description, 3 days after my daughter's memorial service. While I was sedated and grieving and trusting my husband to handle things, Preston had taken $73,000 from our dead child's inheritance and taken his girlfriend to a luxury resort in Arizona. And his sister had taken a cut, and his brother had gotten his car debt paid off. And his parents— I didn't have hard evidence on Sylvia and Gerald yet, but Kaz had flagged 2 more transactions that didn't make sense, and we were still looking. This was not a betrayal. This was a coordinated extraction, and it had been going on for longer than I understood yet. I closed my laptop, I lay down in the dark next to my husband, I listened to him breathe, and I thought, you have no idea what I'm about to do. The next morning, Bridget knocked on our suite door at 9 a.m. in her ski gear, cheeks already flushed, asking if we wanted to hit the mountain before lunch. Preston was in the shower. I opened the door and looked at her. Really looked at her, the expensive parka, the highlighted hair, the breezy confidence of someone who has never once faced a consequence. And I said, absolutely, give me 20 minutes. While I was getting dressed, my phone buzzed. It was Cass. Found the Nevada account registration documents. Also found something else. Call me when you're alone. I typed back, tonight. Keep digging. Preston came out of the bathroom, saw me smiling at my phone, and said, good news? Just Cass, I said, checking in. He nodded. He didn't look nervous. He had no reason to look nervous. As far as he knew, I was a grieving widow in her own private fog, too emotionally wrecked to be paying attention to anything financial. That was what they all thought. That grief had made me soft. That losing Wren had made me smaller. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. At dinner that second night, Preston's niece, Bridget's daughter, a 19-year-old named Sienna, who had her mother's confidence and her grandmother's eyes, leaned across the table and said to her mother, in that giggling, performative way of girls who've never been told no, should we pretend we're family? Like, actually pretend? And the whole table laughed. I didn't laugh. I cut my steak, and I chewed it slowly, and I thought about my mother, who had worked as a hospital records administrator for 31 years to save that $310,000, who had driven a 2009 Honda Civic until it literally stopped running, who had denied herself vacations and new clothes and restaurant meals and every small luxury so that her grandchildren would have something solid under their feet. And I thought about Wren, who would never use that money. Wren, who used to fall asleep in my arms watching nature documentaries and who called butterflies flutterbys until she was 5, and who deserved 100 years she didn't get. And I looked around that table at the Caldwells, laughing and pouring expensive wine and pretending that everything was fine, that they hadn't stolen from a dead child, that they were a real family instead of a beautifully maintained performance of one. I set down my fork very quietly. Okay, I thought, let's pretend. That night, I made the call. Not to Cass, not to Harriet, the other call, the one I'd been holding in reserve, the one I hadn't wanted to make until I was certain, until the evidence was complete, until I had everything lined up in a row like dominoes, and I was ready to watch them fall. I stepped out onto the balcony of our suite at 11 p.m., the mountain air sharp and cold around me, and I dialed a number I had memorized but never saved in my phone. It rang twice. "Is it time?" the voice on the other end asked. "Almost," I said. "Tomorrow night. Everything's ready on our end." "Good," I said. I looked out at the dark slope of the mountain, the scattered lights of the resort below, the impossible quiet of that altitude. "Make sure the documentation is with Harriet before 8 a.m. Friday." "Already done." I hung up. I went back inside. I climbed into bed next to Preston Caldwell and I closed my eyes, and I did not sleep. But I lay very still, and I let myself feel the full weight of what was coming, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the deep, settled calm of someone who has finally, after a very long time, figured out exactly what they need to do. Tomorrow night, the Caldwells of Newport Beach were going to have a visitor. They had spent my daughter's inheritance in one day. They had laughed at me across a dinner table. They had whispered about me like I wasn't there, like I didn't matter, like I was a prop in their performance of a perfect family. What they didn't know, what none of them had even considered because people like the Caldwells never consider it, was that the woman they'd been underestimating for 11 years had been paying very close attention. And she had receipts. The knock came at 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on the hotel nightstand, lying completely still in the dark while Preston slept beside me. And I had been watching that clock for 3 hours, like it was the countdown to something I couldn't take back. Which it was. The knock was sharp, authoritative, not the tentative tap of housekeeping or a confused guest at the wrong door. It was the knock of someone who had every legal right to be standing in that hallway, and it landed in the silence of the Park City mountain night like a stone dropped into still water. Preston jolted awake. I sat up slowly, calmly, and turned on the bedside lamp. "What the?" Preston was already reaching for his phone, already blinking against the light, already confused in that specific way of people who have never truly expected consequences to arrive. "Who's knocking at midnight?" "I'll get it," I said. The 2 officers in the hallway were from the Park City Police Department, but they'd been coordinating with the Newport Beach Financial Crimes Unit for 3 days. Behind them stood a woman in a dark blazer with a leather folio under her arm, a detective named Rosario, who had been the one to tell me, in a phone call 4 days earlier, that what Cass and Harriet had uncovered was enough to open a formal investigation. I had given them everything. Every transfer record, every account registration, every piece of documentation Cass had spent 2 weeks building, and the file Dex Farrow had put together on Tatum Reed, and one additional piece of evidence that I hadn't told anyone about yet. Not Cass, not Harriet, not even Detective Rosario herself. I'd been saving it. "Lorian." Preston was behind me now, barefoot in the hotel hallway in his pajamas, and I could hear in his voice the moment understanding started arriving. Not all at once, that would have been too clean. It came in pieces, like a windshield cracking from the center out. "What is this? What did you do?" I stepped to the side so he could see Detective Rosario clearly. "Mr. Caldwell," Rosario said, "we have some questions about several financial transactions made from the Wren Caldwell Memorial Trust in October of this year. What happened next took 4 hours and involved more doors opening than I expected. Gerald and Sylvia's suite was on the 3rd floor. Bridget's was down the hall from ours. Colt, because this is exactly the kind of detail that tells you everything you need to know about Colt, had to be located in the hotel bar, where he had been drinking with strangers until midnight on a Tuesday. The Caldwells assembled in the hotel conference room, a space usually reserved for corporate retreats and wedding planning sessions, in their robes and pajamas and bare feet. And the contrast between their usual polish and their current dishevelment was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Sylvia looked at me across that conference room table like I had stabbed her. I held her gaze and did not look away. The financial fraud charges were the beginning. Cass had documented the full pattern, not just the $73,000, but a series of smaller extractions over the previous 2 years that totaled another $41,000, taken from joint accounts I had thought were being managed for household expenses and funneled instead into what Preston had internally categorized in his own digital records as family support disbursements. Bridget had received money 9 separate times. Colt's car wasn't the only debt Preston had cleared. There was also a gambling situation in Las Vegas that the family had apparently handled quietly 18 months earlier. Gerald and Sylvia had received what Preston had logged as investment returns on a real estate deal that Cass determined had never actually existed. It was elegant in its own horrifying way. Preston had been running a quiet financial support network for his entire family using money that was, at various points, mine, ours, and finally, unforgivably, Wren's.
But none of that was the piece I'd been saving. Tatum Reed was not just Preston's girlfriend. I found out 4 days before the Park City trip, when Dex sent me a document that made me sit down on my kitchen floor and stay there for a long time. Tatum Reed had filed a civil suit against Preston Caldwell 14 months earlier in Clark County, Nevada, alleging breach of a verbal financial agreement, specifically a promise Preston had made to provide her with a lump sum of $150,000 in exchange for her silence regarding a child, their child. Preston Caldwell had a 2-year-old son in Henderson, Nevada, named Bodie Reed, and he had been making payments to Tatum to keep that child and that relationship invisible. The payments had come from everywhere: joint savings, business accounts, the shell company he'd registered in Delaware that I'd always believed was a legitimate real estate vehicle. And when those funds had run low, when Tatum had threatened to go public with the civil suit, when the pressure had become too great, he had turned to the only large, accessible, emotionally unguarded pool of money left: my dead daughter's inheritance. He had used Wren's money to hide his secret son. Let that land. Let it sit inside your chest exactly where it sat inside mine. I had printed the civil suit documents. I had Dex's full investigative report. I had a photograph of Preston and Tatum and Bodie at a park in Henderson, dated 13 months ago, a Sunday afternoon. Preston pushing the stroller with the easy body language of a man completely comfortable in that life. The life he'd built 16 miles from our own life and kept sealed from me like it existed in a separate dimension. I handed the folder to Detective Rosario in the conference room in front of every single member of the Caldwell family. I watched Preston's face as she opened it. The color left him completely, not gradually, all at once, like a light switched off. And in the silence that followed, while Rosario was reviewing the documents and a second officer was photographing pages, I heard Sylvia make a small sound, a strangled half-word, and I turned to look at her, and for the first time in 11 years, I saw something on Sylvia Caldwell's face that I had never seen before. She already knew. I could see it in the way her eyes slid away from mine immediately, the way her hands folded tight in her lap, the way she looked not at Preston but at Gerald, that specific married couple look that carries entire conversations in a single glance. She knew about Bodie. She had known, maybe not for as long as Preston, but she had known. And she had said nothing. She had stood at my daughter's memorial and hugged me and said nothing. She had sat across from me at that Park City dinner and laughed about whether I was family and said nothing. Gerald looked at the table. Bridget had gone white. Colt, and this was the detail that broke something loose in me, not in a painful way but in a necessary, final, load-bearing way, Colt looked genuinely shocked. Of all of them, Colt actually hadn't known. He'd taken the money Preston offered without asking questions, the way he'd always done everything, on pure self-interested autopilot, but he hadn't known what it was connected to. For one split second, I almost felt something for him. Then I remembered my daughter's name on that trust document, and I let the feeling go. Harriet had filed the civil motion to freeze all joint assets at 8 a.m. that morning, the Friday motion I'd confirmed from the balcony 2 nights before. By the time the Caldwells were sitting in that conference room, every account Preston and I shared had already been locked. The Newport Beach house was flagged pending review of marital asset disclosures.
The boat was irrelevant to me, but it was flagged too, which I admit gave me a small, cold satisfaction. Kaz had also, at my request, prepared a full accounting that traced my personal contributions to the marriage's financial holdings over 11 years, my salary from the brand strategy consulting firm I'd built from nothing before Preston had slowly, charmingly, persistently convinced me to step back from it to focus on the family. My investments, my savings, the business revenue I had folded into joint accounts because I had believed we were partners. Harriet had that accounting ready to present in the divorce proceedings, which I had initiated the previous Monday. Preston hadn't known about the divorce filing either. He found out in that conference room when a hotel staff member, I had called ahead, delivered a sealed envelope to his seat. The boat was irrelevant to me, but it was flagged too, which I admit gave me a small, cold satisfaction. Kaz had also, at my request, prepared a full accounting that traced my personal contributions to the marriage's financial holdings over 11 years, my salary from the brand strategy consulting firm I'd built from nothing before Preston had slowly, charmingly, persistently convinced me to step back from it to focus on the family. My investments, my savings, the business revenue I had folded into joint accounts because I had believed we were partners. Harriet had that accounting ready to present in the divorce proceedings, which I had initiated the previous Monday. Preston hadn't known about the divorce filing either. He found out in that conference room when a hotel staff member, I had called ahead, delivered a sealed envelope to his seat. He said my name once, in the parking garage of the Salt Lake City airport the following morning. I was waiting for my car service. I had already checked out of the hotel, already arranged separate transport, already begun the clean, surgical process of separating my life from his. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like the version of himself that existed under the charm and the Napa cab and the Newport Beach sunlight, and it was smaller than I'd expected, more ordinary, more frightened. "Let me explain," he said. "You don't have to," I said. "Lorian, Tatum, it's complicated. What happened with her was—" "I know exactly what happened with her, Preston. I have a 400-page investigative report." He was quiet. "I want you to understand something," I said, and I kept my voice very steady, the way you keep a voice steady when you have been preparing a speech for weeks and you want every word to land exactly where you aim it. "I don't hate you. I genuinely, truly do not hate you, and I want you to sit with that, because it's not forgiveness and it's not softness. I just don't have room for hatred. I spent 2 years watching Ren fight, and I learned what matters and what doesn't, and you don't matter enough to hate." He flinched. "What you did with her money," I said, and here my voice shifted slightly, just slightly. "You will answer for that in civil court, in criminal court, and in whatever accounting system you actually believe in, if any. You took from a child who is not here to speak for herself. That is yours to carry." My car pulled up. "Bodhi deserves a father who shows up for him," I added, opening the door. "Try to be that. It would be the first useful thing you've ever done with your own money." I got in. I did not look back. Here is what happened over the following 8 months, because you deserve to know. Preston pled to 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty related to the trust. He did not go to prison. This is not that kind of story, and I am not going to lie to you about how justice actually works for wealthy men in this country. But he received 3 years of supervised probation, a $220,000 restitution order, and a public court record that follows a name like his in ways that money cannot fully repair. The civil judgment added another $85,000, which Harriet collected from the sale of the Meridian, which gave me a satisfaction I did not expect. Bridget's lifestyle brand lost its primary sponsor within 2 weeks of the story breaking. A PR firm in Los Angeles had been watching the court filings, and corporations in 2024 are deeply allergic to association with inheritance fraud, which, it turns out, tests very poorly in focus groups. Her Instagram following dropped by 60,000 in a month. She has since pivoted to a podcast about rebuilding authenticity, which I have not listened to and do not intend to. Colt, who cooperated fully with investigators once he understood the alternative, got community service and a fine. He also, according to Kaz, who still follows these things, got a job, an actual sustained job, at a sporting goods company in Irvine. I choose to believe this is character growth. Gerald and Sylvia Caldwell face no criminal charges.
The evidence of their knowing participation wasn't sufficient for prosecution, which Harriet explained to me in her precise, unemotional way, and I accepted it, because I had learned by then that justice is not a complete meal. It is what you can build from what you have. But Sylvia called me once, 6 months later. I don't know how she got through because I'd blocked her, but she called from a number I didn't recognize, and I picked up, and she said, "I should have stopped him. I should have told you." And I said, "Yes, you should have." And I hung up. That was enough. The inheritance, what remained of it after the fraud, after the legal recovery process, came back to me in full, plus interest, plus the restitution. Harriet managed it. She is very good at her job. I used a portion of it to establish the Wren Caldwell Foundation, which funds pediatric palliative care programs at 3 hospitals in Southern California. Wren loved butterflies, so our logo is a flutterby. I couldn't help it. And every year we host a benefit breakfast that raises money for families navigating what we navigated, so they have support I didn't have, comfort I couldn't find, and the dignity that comes from knowing someone sees them. I used another portion to reopen my consulting firm, not the version I'd had before Preston, the careful, diminished version I'd been running when his charm had convinced me to step back, a bigger version. Cass sits on the board. We have 11 clients. We are not plain small. I am sitting on the terrace of a house in Laguna Beach as I write this. Not Newport Beach, not the Caldwell Orbit, somewhere I chose for myself, for no reason except that I liked the light. The Pacific is doing what the Pacific does, which is exist magnificently without caring what anyone thinks about it, and I find that very instructive. Wren used to love the ocean. She used to stand at the edge of the water and let it run over her feet and tip her head back like she was drinking the air. I think about her every day. I think about her without flinching now, which took a long time to be able to do. Grief is not something you get over. It is something you learn to carry with more grace. And on the days when I carry it well, I feel her near me, in the light and the salt air and the quiet. What the Caldwells took from her, from us, they cannot give back. That math will never balance. But what they built on top of that theft, the confidence of people who believe they will never be seen, never be caught, never face a woman who has been paying attention, that was the piece I could touch. That was the piece I could dismantle. And I did. Quietly, carefully, completely, without violence and without hatred, and without losing a single night's sleep I couldn't afford to lose. They thought grief had made me weak. They were not the first people to make that mistake, and they won't be the last, because the world has a long tradition of looking at a woman in pain and seeing nothing dangerous. They looked at me across that Park City dinner table, and they saw a woman they tolerated, a woman who could be laughed at, a woman whose dead daughter's money could be spent in a single afternoon like it meant nothing, like she meant nothing. What they missed, what people like the Caldwells always miss, because wealth and cruelty make you blind to it, is that a woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove is not a woman to dismiss. She is a woman who will spend 6 weeks building an airtight case while making your dinner and pouring your wine and smiling across the table. She is a woman who will book the hotel suite next to yours and sleep calmly beside you and wait for exactly the right moment. She is a woman who knows that the most devastating revenge is not anger, it is precision. My name is Lorian Vance. I kept that name, not his, never again his, because it was mine before he was anything to me, and it will be mine long after he is forgotten. I am 39 years old. I have a company, a foundation, a house with good light, and a best friend who answers on the first ring. I have my daughter's memory, and I carry it forward every single day, and no one will ever put a price on that again. They came for what was hers. I made sure they paid for it with everything that was theirs. Game over.